A criticism that I hear from time to time is that Genjutsu didn't accomplish anything due to it basically being an afterthought in comparison to the other basic jutsu types. It's the only category of jutsu that has a universal counter, and when used in any practical sense, it's never really treated like an actual main attack, but more so a means to set up something else, which is more than likely some form of ninjutsu or taijutsu. This obviously is excluding ocular genjutsu, since the sharingan makes you virtually immune to any other genjutsu that isn't from a sharingan, and it makes your own genjutsu nigh unblockable unless they also have a sharingan. The criticism mostly aims to address the supposed irrelevance or ineffectiveness of regular genjutsu, so I've taken it upon myself to go over every single non-ocular genjutsu usage in the manga to see if the claim is actually the case. I'll be grading each usage on a Boolean style useless or not useless metric, where to be considered not useless, the genjutsu simply has to accomplish its goal or lead to a net positive outcome or end result in the caster's favor. At the end, we'll then tally both, and if it turns out that more often than not it is useless, then that will simply be the conclusion. But enough of me rambling. Make sure to like and subscribe. We're shooting for 10k, and go follow my Twitter at Kap'nKat, link in bio. Now, the first ever genjutsu used in Naruto is the genjutsu that Kakashi used on Sakura in the bell test. The databook entry for this genjutsu doesn't really say much, but the premise of the jutsu is that it shows you the one thing you least want to see. So in Sakura's case, it showed her an image of a brutally maimed Sasuke. We aren't explicitly told why Kakashi specifically used Genjutsu on her, but given that it's the bell test, he more than likely just wanted to incapacitate her just like he did Naruto and Sasuke. This obviously accomplished his goal, seen as though she was knocked out, so this is a pretty easy not useless. The next time we see Genjutsu in action is the beginning of the Chunin exams, where Kotetsu and Izumo casted an environmental Genjutsu to change the floor number, making it seem as if they were on the third floor, but in reality it was only the second. Sakura and Sasuke were easily able to figure out that it was an illusion, undoing the Genjutsu altogether, but whether or not the Genjutsu served its purpose is sort of up for interpretation. On one hand, you could make the argument that having your Genjutsu broken by 2 genin while being an experienced Chunin automatically makes your Genjutsu useless, but this perspective lacks a bit of context. The proctors of the exam, similarly to Kakashi in the bell test, are only there to evaluate the students and not actually go all out, since it makes no sense to make an obstacle that's impossible to pass by a genin. It's far more likely for it to be the case that the illusion was made specifically to weed out the bottom tier participants, and as such I think it's fair to say that it accomplished its goal. Moving on to the actual Chunin exams, Orochimaru casts a Genjutsu on Sasuke and Sakura that injects a simulation into your mind where you experience yourself getting killed in gruesome fashion. The effect is extremely potent as Sakura pees herself and Sasuke throws up, saying that the Genjutsu made him feel and believe it. Orochimaru then notes that after experiencing the Genjutsu they should be paralyzed, which means that his jutsu was to restrain them in some capacity. Despite this though, Sasuke is still able to shake off the fear paralysis by stabbing himself in the leg, and manages to protect Sakura from a kunai thrown by Orochimaru. So when all said and done, the Genjutsu didn't really do much, since its only purpose was to paralyze them long enough to hit them with the kunai, which it ultimately failed at doing. There is also this scene with Anko where a couple of Anbu members use the art of paralysis on these giant tigers. However, it's kind of unclear what it means exactly, so if you're of my opinion, which is that it's a form of Genjutsu, then it would be a not useless, since it accomplished its goal of restraining the tigers and saving Anko. Later on, Team 7 meets up with Kabuto where they get trapped by the slime mine technique and forced to walk around in circles. Kabuto asserts that the person who casted the Genjutsu was doing it to wear them out so they could make a move on a fatigued target. His assertion was proven to be true, as almost immediately after, Oboru, Mubi, and Kagari showed up to get revenge on Sasuke for injuring them earlier, as well as get their scroll. This doesn't work in the slightest, since in the end they all got one-shotted by a singular kick to the face by Naruto, which means that all of the rigmarole of leading them in a circle to tire them out and using illusionary clones amounting to nothing. Something else that's interesting is that both Sasuke and Kabuto surmised that the clone jutsu that they used were a form of Genjutsu, but in the databook the Haze clone jutsu, which is what Team Oboru used, is classified as a ninjutsu. I just thought that was interesting. Similarly, Kabuto's Genjutsu is kind of interesting in the way that on paper it's supposed to be super effective, but in practice not only did it not accomplish anything, it may have even made it easier on Konoha. When the Genjutsu was cast, based on what we see, only civilians and genin were affected by it. Kabuto then says leave it to the Konoha elites, they would notice and reverse the Genjutsu, which implies that only the top jonin were unaffected. However, this is simply not the case, since we see Sakura, Sasuke, Shikamaru, and Shino, who were all genin at the time, as well as Ayoba and Raido being able to completely reverse it as well. This means that everyone of at least Chunin level skill, which is the largest shinobi demographic, should still be functioning after it was cast, which renders the entire thing useless. But not only that, since the Genjutsu only really worked on the civilians and genin, it removed one less obstacle for the actual combat ninjas, seen as though they wouldn't have to fight while trying to protect hysterical non-combatants. But don't get me wrong, the invasion still worked and they assassinated the Hokage. However, Kabuto's Genjutsu itself didn't really accomplish anything, or even in the worst case was a net negative. Kurenai's Genjutsu on Itachi is in a similar boat where in theory it should have worked. However, the person she went up against had a sharingan, and Itachi sharingan no less. The second databook states that she excels in Genjutsu, and although she was defeated, she was engaged in a equal Genjutsu battle with Itachi. It further goes on to say that while unleashing her high-grade Genjutsu, she disturbed Itachi, showing she could overturn Itachi's Genjutsu, nullifying it in a critical moment. However, Itachi reflected her own Genjutsu back onto her using the Genjutsu Gaishi reflection technique. This is an ability that is granted to all users of the Sharingan, as it stated earlier on that the Sharingan gives the user the ability to penetrate and see the reality behind any illusion and reflect them back onto the caster. This move by Kurenai did absolutely nothing for her, unfortunately, and while it may not be entirely her fault, in the end the Genjutsu accomplished nothing. Now past this point, we don't see any usage of non-Sharingan Genjutsu until the Sasuke retrieval arc with the introduction of Tayuya. Tayuya, after getting cornered by Shikamaru, undergoes her version 2 curse mark transformation and casts her musical Genjutsu Chains of Fantasia. This Genjutsu puts the target in a hellscape simulation with strings hung from a liquid ceiling that binds the target in a crucifix position. In there, the target will experience strange phenomena such as having their flesh melt off their bones, and Tayuya knows that the Genjutsu is specifically meant to stop or bind the physical movement of those captive. However, not even a couple seconds later, Shikamaru breaks out of it by using his shadow stitching to move his fingers, breaking it, releasing him from the Genjutsu through self-inflicted pain. Now you would assume I'd give it a useless rating, seeing as though Shikamaru broke out of it so easily. However, Tayuya won that fight and was gonna kill Shikamaru if not for the interference of a third party that was not a part of Shikamaru's squad and couldn't have possibly been accounted for. Because of her Genjutsu, it forced Shikamaru to put himself in a risky position where he was banking on the strength of his binding to take the fight to close quarters. But Tayuya, having her curse mark, had the power to overcome the shadow bind and would have taken him out if not for Tamari. So it wouldn't be fair to say that it didn't do anything when it won her fight with Shikamaru specifically. Rin also had Genjutsu used on her for interrogation by the 2 stone shinobi and Kakashi Gaiden. However, Kakashi knows that they try to get her to talk, and Kako said he was losing out on precious information, implying that he had not yet acquired any intel. Fast forward to the Kazekage rescue arc, we get one single Genjutsu usage, and it's by Itachi, which I should preface was not a Sharingan Genjutsu. The Genjutsu that Itachi used was the finger Genjutsu, aptly named ephemeral, that Itachi used to try and put Naruto to sleep. The Genjutsu was fairly potent as Naruto was struggling to undo it, but it ultimately got broken by Sakura and Chiyo and failed to complete its task, rendering it useless. After this, we don't see any non-Sharingan Genjutsu being used until the Jiraiya Gallant arc, where Jiraiya, or should I say Ma and Pa, utilize one of the most powerful Genjutsu within the series, what we colloquially refer to as simply Frog Song. However, this is not the same jutsu. The Genjutsu that Ma and Pa used in conjunction with Jiraiya is a Genjutsu known as the Toad Confrontation Chant or Toad Confrontation Song, not to be confused with another Genjutsu that goes by simply Frog Song. Fukasaku describes it as their most powerful Genjutsu, where they confound an opponent's sense of hearing with a song, and this works by having both he and Ma combine their sounds to create the melody that traps the opponent in the Genjutsu. However, the drawback is that once they start singing, their location gets revealed, and with the fact that it takes a little while to take effect, they effectively become sitting ducks until the Genjutsu actually activates. With this Genjutsu though, Jiraiya was able to trap 3 of the 6 paths of pain, but there are 2 interpretations that you can get from this. As we all know, Jiraiya made a miscalculation in assuming that there were only 3 and got jumped by all 6 after he trapped the 3 in the Genjutsu. But remember, Jiraiya's mission was strictly intel gathering. Go in, gather information on Pain, and get out. His fight with Pain was not a part of the mission, so whether or not he lost wouldn't matter in this context as long as he gathered enough intel. Let me put this into perspective for you. The first 3 paths of Pain were going to kill Jiraiya if not for Frog Song, and his life was extended by the use of the Genjutsu. If Jiraiya had died before then, he wouldn't have ever gotten to see the other paths of Pain, and thus would not be able to gather intel from them. Because of him taking down 3 with Frog Song, he was given the chance to fight all 6, albeit terribly, and thus able to gather intel on them to aid in Naruto's future fight against the Paths of Pain. You could also make the case that the only reason Jiraiya could survive the initial onslaught and hide in his pocket dimension, which he then exited so Fukasaku could report the intel, was because he took out 3 of them, forcing Nagato to expend chakra, reviving them, thus making him weaker. Now the other interpretation is that Jiraiya's intel was redundant or useless due to the way how the Pain invasion played out. For starters, any information about any of the Paths of Pain before Naruto's arrival becomes irrelevant since Pain nuked the entire village and killed off a good portion of the population. What good would that intel do in this situation? None of it would matter since everyone is already dead and would die to Tendo regardless of the information they received. Next is that Naruto was getting his intel from Katsuyu, who was scattered across the village healing people during the attack, so she would be aware of all of the abilities of all the Paths of Pain by proxy. This would negate any importance of Jiraiya's intel, since she would have already observed anything that Jiraiya could have possibly gathered. However, this is pure speculation, so take with it what you will. You could also argue that the Genjutsu made Jiraiya put up more of a fight, which helped to delay Pain's invasion of the Leaf. Pain was supposed to head out right before Jiraiya arrived in the Rain Village, but his intrusion pushed it back to where they invaded in canon. So with that in mind, I think it's fair to give Jiraiya this one. However, if you subscribe to the second interpretation and think the invasion delay is a reach, then you can put this one as useless. Heading into the Pain arc, we see Ma and Pa utilize the actual Frog Song to incapacitate the summonings of the Animal Path. This allowed Naruto to land 2 Sage Art Odama Rasengans, taking out 2 of the Animal Path's forces. This significantly reduced the number of combatants that Naruto and the Toads had to deal with simultaneously, so this clearly accomplished its goal. Going into the 5 Kage Summit, the only Genjutsu we see get deployed was C's Light Illusion Flash Pillar that he used against Sasuke and Jugo. The Genjutsu released a blinding flash of light that projected the image of Sasuke getting pummeled into the ground by the Raikage into Jugo's mind. Sasuke easily countered it via Sharingan hacks, but for the same reason as to why I gave Tayuya the point, Sasuke would have died here at the hands of the Raikage if not for the interference of Suigetsu. Because although Suigetsu is a part of Sasuke's squad, he was hiding till that point, so there would be no way for them to even account account for him showing up and blocking the attack. But even if I were to grant that, it still puts the Raikage squad in a net positive outcome, since not only did they not lose anything from casting the Genjutsu, they managed to break Suigetsu's sword and force him to expend chakra, regenerating his arms. This obviously isn't the biggest benefit ever provided by the use of a Genjutsu, but at the end of the day, a plus is a plus. Gengetsu, however, undoubtedly had the most clear case of a useful Genjutsu, because throughout his entire time using his clam Genjutsu, he was actively trying to lose and was failing horribly. After he casted his Genjutsu, it cuts away to Naruto and B's fight with Itachi and Nagato, but when it cuts back, Gengetsu is surrounded by a slew of dead bodies, saying that he's not really trying to win. He straight up says that he's telling the Alliance his weaknesses, but they are too useless to capitalize off of it. He then goes on to say, and I quote, "I already told you I'm not even here. All you're seeing is my clam's wide-range Genjutsu. It's a mirage. Physical attacks are useless. Crush the clam or this will never end." And while yes, they did eventually manage to break the clam and dispel the Genjutsu, the damage was already done. The purpose of the reanimated shinobi were to fight the Alliance and build their numbers, for which Gengetsu did a very good job as seen by the numerous dead bodies left in his path. Like, there is quite literally nothing else you could ask for from the jutsu. It got casted, it was art to dispel, and killed a whole bunch of people, which is exactly what it was meant to do. Now for the last usage in the entire series, we have another Sage Genjutsu. However, this one is essentially a beefed up version of another Genjutsu that we've covered earlier. Kabuto's version of Tayuya's musical Genjutsu, Chains of Fantasia, was basically set up for failure, even though it honestly would have been GG's for anybody except for the two people he was fighting. Because despite Sasuke and Itachi both having Mangekyo Sharingan, which at that point should make you virtually immune to all non-Sharingan Genjutsu, Kabuto was still able to trap them with his Genjutsu. It's sort of like a trend with sound-based and jutsu-enhanced Genjutsu, where they essentially take the role of the strongest Genjutsu, barring the ones from the Sharingan, especially given the fact that they bypass the armor of the Susanoo and are basically unblockable due to being sound, and the only way to react to and track sound is through hearing, and if you can hear it, you've already been caught. However, even with all this glaze, it didn't amount to anything in the face of two top tier Uchiha, since they just broke themselves out by casting their own Sharingan Genjutsu on each other. Kabuto's plan was to restrain them with the Genjutsu so he could eat Sasuke, but since they broke out of it prematurely, his attack was countered and his plan pretty much went down the drain. It also wouldn't have mattered anyway, since he was already under the setup for Izanami and Itachi was gonna get him regardless. It's one of those cases where if it was any other context then it would have worked out, but at the end of the day, the jutsu just simply didn't accomplish anything. And with this, it leaves us with a count of 7 not useless and 7 useless moments, giving us a draw. However, in my opinion, the fact that the amount of Genjutsu was so small and the numbers were so close indicates that this is clearly an underdeveloped aspect of Naruto's power system. But anyways, that's pretty much it for the video. Let me know what y'all want to see in the comments down below, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Bye bye.